Hello and welcome to an introduction to soldering. I'm going to go over a couple of different techniques of soldering. The first is the most basic and what I do with beginners, which is soldering onto copper tape. This is the easiest thing we can do. So what I've got is my soldering iron, got it set to 650 degrees. I have some solder here. I'm already wearing some eye protection. Solder you can just break. And the first thing I want to do is I'll take out my soldering iron. I'll look at the tip and see how it looks. I can see a little bit of silver on there where there's some solder. That's good. I actually want there to be a little solder there. In order for things to work out well later, I'm going to start out by melting a little solder onto the tip. And I can see it sticking to it. That's good. And then I'm just going to see if you can see this. I'm going to actually pretty gently put it in the steel wool here and just twist it a little bit. And now I can see I have a nice, even, thin coating of solder on the tip of the soldering iron. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to solder an LED onto the copper tape so that it goes into the middle there. And I could potentially hook up a battery to one side and a resistor over here, and then have my circuit work, and it would all stick to this piece of paper. The easiest way is to just melt a little puddle of solder everywhere that you want to connect something. So you can see what I'm doing. I'm just getting the copper tape hot. It heats up really quickly if you have some solder already stuck on the soldering iron. If you don't, if it's totally dry, if it looks oxidized, it doesn't conduct heat very well. So you want a little bit of solder on the tip of the soldering iron. It heats up the copper tape really quickly, and I'm touching the solder at where the tip of the soldering iron meets the copper foil, because that's the hottest spot. And it doesn't actually take very much. This is plenty in either of these spots. So I'll go ahead, I'll just gently put that in the steel wool again, and I'll re-tin it, get a little solder on the tip on both sides, and I'm going to line up my LED with where I want to connect it to the copper tape. I want this to go quickly, so I have solder on the tip of the soldering iron, and I have my puddle of solder there. It's already dry, but I'm going to remelt it. And if I have some solder stuck to the tip here, it'll happen very quickly and very efficiently. So I'm touching only the plastic. I don't want to touch any metal. And I'm just going to push down firmly. And see how quick that was? And if you can see, the solder has gone up around the lead and it's holding it very firmly. And I'll get this lined up too. And I've still got some melted solder on the tip there, so that's good. And I'm just going to push down firmly, and then it melts. Move the soldering iron away, and it's stuck. These are already dry, cool enough to touch. This stuff cools really fast. This stays really hot. You can't touch that. And then after I've soldered, I just twirl it around in the steel wool a little bit. And this is fine. This is how you'll make all of your most basic circuits in prototyping. Now I'm going to solder a couple of components into this little perforated board. It has these little metal pads here where I can connect components, or where I can make a component stick inside here. I'm going to have to stick an electrical lead through one of those holes, and I'm going to go ahead and just solder this in place, and later I could solder something to it. You'll see that these are symmetric. It's the same on either side. So I'm just going to go ahead and find two spots here. They're pretty close together. All right. And I've got it pressed up pretty close. Let's see if I can get that in focus. That's probably good enough. And the leads are coming out this way. Now to get things to hold still, The trick is you just bend these back a little bit. And now it's going to hold still for me while I solder it in place. This is a little bit more complicated, or a little bit trickier than the first method of soldering, but it's going to be a pretty similar procedure. First, I'm going to just gently twirl that in the steel wool. I'll put a little solder on the tip of the soldering iron so it conducts heat well. Okay. And I put a fair amount on there that time, so that might just be enough to do everything. But what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to simultaneously get the lead and that round metal pad hot. And if I can get them both hot at the same time with some solder on here, then this solder, there's enough on here that it'll just stick to both of them. And I may not need any more. Okay, and that looks good. I can see that the solder is flat on the pad, and it goes up in a nice cone shape like that. I don't want to see any round looking bubbles or anything like that on the lead. If you see something that looks like a ball of solder, that means that it's not sticking well. It's not a good physical connection on there. And what you need is a good physical and electrical connection. Now on this one, I'm going to get the pad and the lead hot, and this time I'm actually going to move a little solder in and just melt a little on there. And that one actually looks a little better. I just twirl it in the steel wool there. And let's see if we can't make this zoom a little. And it's pretty small, but inside there you can see it's connected well. It's sturdy. And now I'd take some wire clippers and I just trim off the excess wire there, and then we'd be good to go. Yeah. And this is for making a more permanent circuit after you've already made a prototype on a solderless breadboard. The final technique I have for you is soldering two components directly together. This can be a little bit of a pain actually, but it's really handy sometimes. The first thing I want to do is tape at least one of these things down so it stays still. They make really fancy equipment for doing this too, but it turns out that a little bit of blue tape works pretty well. I'm going to get a little solder. Well, first I'll twirl the iron in the steel wool, melt a little solder on the tip of the soldering iron. It sticks, and that's nice. And now I'm going to heat up one lead, and I'm not sure if you can see it, but I've melted a little solder and it's stuck onto the lead of this resistor. And I'll do the same thing to the LED. Happens pretty quickly. Get off there. Being careful not to burn myself again. And so I've got a little bit of solder on the end of that lead and a little bit on the end of that lead. Now I'll just gently twirl that in there so it's nice and clean. Still has some melted solder on that, and that's good. Here's a little bit more to help things stick together. And now I'm going to get this to lie flat. And I want this to happen pretty quickly so that I don't burn myself. But I've got these two things lined up. If I cross them just a little bit like that, so it's a real shallow X, that's the easiest thing. And I have a little bubble of solder on the tip of the soldering iron. What I'm really going to go for here is just melting the solder already on both of those leads together. And I've used a lot here, so it's not drying real quickly. Alright. And just gently twirling the soldering iron and checking to make sure it has some solder back in there. I'm done soldering right now, so before I put the soldering iron away, what I'm going to do is make sure that I twirl the tip of the soldering iron gently in the steel wool, and then I want to leave it with a little bit of solder on both sides of the tip so it looks nice and shiny. So I'm putting a little blob on both sides, and then just gently putting in the steel wool again So it doesn't have a whole lot of solder there, but it's got a nice silver coating on both sides, and that'll make it a lot nicer for the next person that shows up. I've turned it off. I'll wait 5 minutes or so, and then I can put everything back in the box.